In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, the Orks stand as one of the galaxy's most perplexing contradictions. These green-skinned warriors live for battle. They crave violence the way humans crave air and water. Fighting is not merely what they do, it is what they are, encoded into every strand of their fungal DNA by the ancient Old Ones who created them millions of years ago. An Ork without a fight is like a fire without oxygen, slowly dying from the inside out. They will battle anyone, anything, anywhere. They charge headlong into gunfire, with savage grins splitting their brutal faces. They wrestle with creatures 10 times their size. They pit themselves against the galaxy's most terrifying war machines with nothing but crude weapons and unshakable confidence. And yet, there exists a foe that even these unstoppable engines of destruction will turn away from. A warrior so antithetical to everything that makes an Ork that the greenskins would rather fight literally anything else in the galaxy. That warrior is the Grey Knight's Dreadnought. This is not a tale of cowardice. Orks do not understand fear the way other species do. This is something far stranger, far more fundamental to the very nature of both species. To understand why the most fight-hungry Xenos in the galaxy will actively avoid engaging these particular war machines, we need to journey deep into the psychic underpinnings of Ork society, explore the unique nature of the Grey Knight's anti-demon crusade, and uncover how these two forces create a perfect storm of incompatibility on the battlefield. The story begins not with armor or weapons, but with belief itself. The foundation of the Green Tide, understanding Ork psychology. To comprehend why Orks refuse to engage Grey Knight's Dreadnoughts, we must first understand what drives an Ork at the most fundamental level. These are not simple creatures, despite what their brutish appearance and crude language might suggest. Beneath the surface of every greenskin beats a connection to one of the galaxy's most powerful psychic phenomena, the Wag. The Wag is far more than a battle cry, though it certainly serves that purpose admirably when bellowed from the throats of millions of charging Orks. It is a gestalt psychic field generated by all Orks collectively, a shared unconscious energy that binds the species together and literally shapes reality around them. This is not metaphor or exaggeration. The Wag field is a measurable psychic force that grows stronger with every Ork that joins it, creating a feedback loop of escalating power and aggression. Individual Orks possess virtually no psychic ability of their own. Unlike the Eldar with their refined psychic disciplines, or human psykers who can bend the warp to their will, a single Ork standing alone generates barely a flicker in the Imperium. But Orks are never meant to stand alone. When they gather in groups, when they form tribes and warbands, when they coalesce into the massive migrations called Wags, their collective psychic presence becomes a roaring tide of green energy that can be felt across star systems. This gestalt field accomplishes several remarkable things. First, and most importantly, it allows Orks to instinctively recognize hierarchy. They don't need badges of rank or elaborate ceremonies. Through the Wag field, every Ork can sense who is bigger and therefore who deserves to be in charge. This is not just about physical size, though that certainly factors into the equation. The Wag field responds to success in battle, to victories won and enemies crushed. An Ork who fights well and survives grows larger and stronger, not merely through exercise or improved nutrition, but through a psychic and physiological transformation, driven by the respect and recognition of other Orks. Consider how this works in practice. A young Ork, fresh from the spore fields, stands perhaps 6 feet tall with lean muscle and crude weapons. He joins a mob, participates in battles, and if he survives and fights well, other Orks begin to respect him. This respect is not verbal. Orks rarely waste time with compliments, but psychic. The Wag field registers his success, and his body responds by growing larger and more powerful. His muscles thicken, his bones strengthen, and his already formidable constitution becomes even more resilient. If he continues to succeed, he may grow to become a knob, standing head and shoulders above his fellows at 8 or 9 feet tall. Continue further, and he might become a war boss, a towering figure of 10 feet or more, who dominates through sheer physical presence, reinforced by psychic authority. The most successful orcs can reach truly staggering sizes. The legendary war boss known as the Beast, who nearly destroyed the Imperium in the 32nd Millennium, stood close to the height of an Imperial knight war machine. He could speak fluent Gothic, commanded massive fleets and armies with tactical sophistication that shocked Imperial commanders, and wielded technology that far exceeded anything seen in modern orc society. He was not an aberration, but a glimpse of what orcs can become when their WH40K field reaches critical mass. This brings us to the second function of the WH field, technological influence. Orc technology is legendarily ramshackle. Their guns are held together with wire and hope. Their vehicles are cobbled together from scrap metal, with no apparent regard for engineering principles. Their spacecraft defy every known law of physics, and yet somehow achieve faster-than-light travel. How is this possible? The answer lies in belief. When enough orcs believe something will work, the WH field makes it work. This is not unlimited reality-warping power. An orc cannot simply wish his enemies away or materialize weapons from thin air. But within certain parameters, the collective belief of orcs can bridge gaps in engineering, make incompatible parts function together, and turn garbage into functional war machines. The most famous example of this is the orc belief that red vehicles go faster. To any rational observer, paint color should have no effect on vehicle performance. But orcs believe with absolute certainty that red equals speed, and so when they paint their war buggies and bikes red, those vehicles do measurably move faster than their unpainted equivalents. The same principle applies to their weapons. A gun that would jam and explode in human hands functions perfectly for an orc because the orc expects it to work, and the WH field obligingly makes reality conform to that expectation. This is why captured orc weapons are notoriously unreliable when used by other species. Without the psychic field to hold the crude machinery together, the inherent flaws become apparent and the weapons fail. Imperial forces that have attempted to use looted orc equipment quickly learned that what works for a greenskin becomes a useless pile of scrap in human hands. The third and perhaps most crucial function of the WH field, for our purposes, is how it shapes orc perception of the battlefield. Orcs perceive threats and targets through a lens colored by their psychic connection. They are drawn to worthy opponents, to enemies that will provide a good fight and opportunities for glory. Size matters tremendously to this calculation. Bigger enemies mean better fights, which means more respect from other orcs, which feeds back into the WH field and drives further growth. An orc facing a towering space marine in power armor feels excitement. This is a proper enemy, big and strong and dangerous. Defeating such a foe will earn respect and make the orc grow bigger himself. An orc charging toward an Imperial knight or enemy gargant feels pure joy. This is the kind of fight that songs are sung about, the kind of battle that separates the truly mighty from the merely adequate. Even suicidal charges against impossible odds don't deter orcs, because the potential for glory outweighs any concern for survival. But machines, cold dead machines, with no living presence to defeat, no warrior spirit to overcome, hold little appeal. Orcs understand intellectually that vehicles and war engines are dangerous. They're not stupid, despite what Imperial propaganda might suggest. But there's a visceral difference between fighting a tank and fighting a living enemy. The tank might kill you, but defeating it brings no real satisfaction. There's no warrior to humiliate, no opponent to prove yourself superior to. It's just metal and explosions, unsatisfying and somewhat boring even when deadly. This preference is baked into Ork psychology at a fundamental level. As one Imperial Lex mechanic recorded after extensive observation of Ork behavior, the greenskins do dislike fighting machines due to the lack of satisfying feeling or visceral quality to it. They want to hear their enemy scream, to see the recognition of defeat in their eyes, to feel the satisfaction of proving themselves the superior warrior. Machines don't scream the right way. They don't show fear or acknowledge defeat. They just stop working, which is profoundly unsatisfying to an Ork. This preference shapes their battlefield behavior in measurable ways. Given a choice between charging into a formation of Imperial Guardsmen or assaulting a squadron of Lehman Russ tanks, Orks will almost always choose the Guardsmen. The tanks represent a greater tactical threat, but the Guardsmen represent better opponents in the Ork understanding of what makes a fight worthwhile. This is not cowardice, but priority. Fight the living first, destroy the machines if you must, but never choose cold metal over warm flesh if you have any option. Now imagine an Ork encountering something that appears to be a machine, walking on mechanical legs, wielding massive weapons, encased in heavy armor plating, but which registers to their psychic senses as something far worse. Something that doesn't just lack the appeal of a living opponent, but actively repels the WH field itself. Something that makes an Ork feel disconnected from the psychic network that defines his very existence. That is what it feels like to face a Grey Knight's Dreadnought. The Silver Warriors, understanding the Grey Knights. The Grey Knights stand alone among the Imperium's countless military forces. They are not merely another Space Marine chapter with different colors and tactics. They represent something fundamentally different, something that pushes the boundaries of what posthuman warriors can achieve. To understand their dreadnoughts, we must first understand the warriors themselves. Chapter 6666 of the Adeptus Astartes, the Grey Knights were founded in the dying days of the Horus heresy on the direct orders of the Emperor himself. While the Imperium burned and brother fought brother across 1,000 worlds, the Emperor foresaw a greater threat that would outlast the immediate crisis of traitorous Primarchs and corrupted legions. Even if Horus was defeated, even if the traitor legions were driven into the Eye of Terror, the powers of chaos would remain. Demons would continue to threaten humanity. Corruption would seek to poison the souls of the faithful, and the energies of the warp would batter ceaselessly at the barriers between real space and the immaterium. For these threats, conventional forces would not suffice. What was needed was a weapon forged specifically to combat the demonic. Warriors who could face the denizens of the warp without flinching, without faltering, without ever succumbing to corruption, no matter how dire the circumstances. Thus were the Grey Knights born, created from gene seed of the highest purity and subjected to trials that would break even other Space Marines. Every Grey Knight's recruit undergoes the 666 rituals of detestation, tests designed to prove beyond any doubt that the candidate can withstand horrors that would shatter normal minds. These are not symbolic rituals, but genuine trials, where failure means death or worse. Candidates are exposed to warp energies, shown demonic entities, forced to confront temptations and terrors that would drive ordinary humans mad. And when they survive, when they prove themselves capable of facing chaos itself without corruption, they are welcomed into the chapter with one final transformation. Their memories are erased. Every experience from their previous life, every attachment to family or homeworld, every personal fear or desire that a demon might exploit, all of it is surgically removed from their minds. They become blank slates upon which the chapter can write new purpose, new identity, new dedication to the Emperor and the war against chaos. It is a brutal process, arguably more invasive than any other transformation in the Imperium's military forces, but it is deemed necessary. A Grey Knight cannot have weaknesses for demons to exploit. They must be utterly incorruptible. But the true secret that sets Grey Knights apart from all other Space Marines is simple and absolute. Every single one of them is a psyker. In most Space Marine chapters, psykers are rare specialists called librarians, carefully monitored and kept in check by the chapter's chaplains. The dangers of psychic power are well understood. An undisciplined psyker can become a gateway for demonic possession, allowing entities from the warp to pour into real space and wreak havoc. Most psykers who survive the Black Ship's culling are either sanctioned to serve the Imperium in limited capacities or sacrificed to sustain the Emperor himself. The idea of an entire chapter of psykers seems impossibly dangerous. And yet the Grey Knights make it work. More than work, they make it their greatest strength. Every battle brother commands psychic powers that would make him a powerful asset in any other chapter. Every warrior can channel his mental energies into devastating attacks, protective barriers, and combat prescience that allows him to predict enemy movements before they happen. They can teleport across battlefields in coordinated strikes that appear from nowhere to decapitate enemy leadership. They can manifest their psychic powers through their weapons, turning already deadly force swords into instruments capable of banishing demons with a single strike. The source of this seemingly impossible purity lies in their training, their gene seed, and the wards woven into their very flesh. Beneath their skin, every Grey Knight bears hexagrammic and pentagrammic wards, psychoactive tattoos inscribed with prayers and litanies against corruption. These are not merely symbolic but functional, creating a psychic barrier that repels demonic influence. Combined with their mental conditioning and the inherent purity of their gene seed, these wards make Grey Knights uniquely resistant to chaos corruption. This resistance is embodied in what the chapter calls the Aegis. The Aegis is both a physical thing, a network of psychoconductive filaments and blessed circuitry woven into their armor, and a psychic discipline that every Grey Knight learns from their earliest days as a neophyte. When a Grey Knight focuses his will through the Aegis, he creates a barrier of pure faith and psychic force that turns aside demonic powers, negates sorcerous attacks, and provides protection against the very energies of the warp itself. The Aegis is not passive protection. It is an active projection of the Grey Knight's will, a declaration of purity and purpose that makes demons recoil in pain. Where a normal Space Marine might resist chaos through faith and willpower alone, a Grey Knight actively harms demonic entities simply by being near them. His presence is anathema to creatures of the warp. His psychic aura is a beacon of sanctified power that burns like fire against corruption. This makes Grey Knights devastatingly effective against their primary foes. A demon that could shrug off bolter fire and laugh at las blasts finds itself vulnerable to a Grey Knight's nemesis force weapon. A greater demon that might dominate an entire battlefield discovers that its reality-warping powers falter and fail when brought to bear against the Aegis. Even the most powerful demon princes, beings of godlike might who have ruled worlds and commanded legions, have fallen before the combined psychic might of Grey Knights' strike forces. But the Grey Knights do not only fight demons. When necessity demands, they can bring their considerable abilities to bear against any foe. Their psychic powers, their superior training, and their blessed war gear make them effective against all manner of enemies. Xenos warlords, traitor Astartes, and even the horrifying monsters of the Tyrannid swarms, all have fallen to Grey Knights when the chapter has been called upon to intervene. Yet every deployment is calculated with care. Grey Knights are rare beyond measure. The entire chapter numbers only around 1,000 warriors, divided into 10 brotherhoods of approximately 100 each. Compared to the Imperium's countless billions of soldiers, compared even to the million or so Space Marines scattered across 1,000 chapters, the Grey Knights are a tiny force. They cannot be everywhere. They cannot fight every battle. They must choose their deployments with precision, striking only where their unique capabilities are absolutely necessary. This scarcity makes every Grey Knight precious beyond calculation. When one falls in battle, the loss is felt throughout the entire chapter, and when a Grey Knight is wounded so severely, that his body is broken beyond even the abilities of the chapter's apothecaries to repair. A terrible choice must be made. Most Grey Knights prefer to die. They would rather their names be inscribed in the crypts beneath the chapter's fortress monastery on Titan, laid to rest with full honors alongside their fallen brothers. Death in service to the Emperor is considered the proper end for a warrior who has spent his entire existence fighting the forces of chaos. It is clean, final, and honorable. But sometimes a warrior's knowledge and experience are too valuable to lose. Sometimes a brother captain or grand master has accumulated such tactical expertise, such understanding of demonic behavior and warp phenomena, that allowing him to die would represent an unacceptable loss to the chapter. In these rare cases, with the wounded warrior's consent, and consent is required, for the Grey Knights do not force this fate upon any warrior, he may be interred within a dreadnought. And it is these interred warriors, these ghosts in shells of blessed ceramite and adamantium, that Orks will not fight. Walking tombs of silver and faith, the Grey Knights, Dreadnought. The Dreadnought is ancient technology, dating back to the Age of Strife and the earliest days of the Imperium. The basic concept is simple enough. Take a mortally wounded warrior, place what remains of his body into a cybernetic sarcophagus, and encase that sarcophagus within a massive armored walker equipped with devastating weapons. The warrior becomes the machine. His neural impulses directly controlling its movements, his consciousness sustained by sophisticated life support systems that can maintain a severely damaged body for centuries or even millennia. For most Space Marine chapters, becoming a dreadnought is considered a great honor. It allows a hero to continue serving the Emperor long after mortal flesh would have failed. Ancient warriors who fought in the Horus heresy itself still stride into battle in their dreadnought shells, their experience and wisdom, invaluable assets to their chapters. To be chosen for internment is to be deemed worthy of eternal service, to have your sacrifice acknowledged and your value recognized. Grey Knights view it differently. They see the dreadnought not as an honor, but as a burden, albeit one they will bear if duty demands. The chapter's legends speak of Grand Master Orias, who lay dying from wounds inflicted by a demon prince. For 3 days he remained motionless as his brothers watched, waiting for his soul to depart for the Emperor's side. On the 3rd day, Orias moved once, a single nod, and then was still again. The assembled brother captains debated the meaning of this gesture and ultimately concluded it was consent to internment. Orias now serves as one of the chapter's venerable dreadnoughts, his tactical genius still available to guide younger warriors, even as he surely longs for the peace of final rest. But what makes a Grey Knight's dreadnought truly unique is not the warrior within, but the systems built into the machine itself. These are not standard dreadnought chassis modified with better weapons. They are purpose-built war machines designed specifically to enhance and amplify the psychic abilities of the bulky warrior entombed within. Every Grey Knight's dreadnought features an extensive Aegis system far more sophisticated than what can be incorporated into standard power armor. The sarcophagus is lined with psychoconductive circuitry, blessed servos, and consecrated power cores, all specifically designed to channel and amplify psychic energies. Prayers and wards are not merely inscribed on the armor, but woven into its very structure at the molecular level, creating a psychic resonance that echoes throughout the entire machine. This allows the dreadnought to do something remarkable. Through specialized cyber circuitry built into the sarcophagus, the warrior within can link his own Aegis field to those of nearby Grey Knight's battle brothers. This creates a networked defensive system where the protections are greater than the sum of their parts. A single Grey Knight has a formidable Aegis. A squad of Grey Knights has an Aegis that can turn aside all but the most powerful demon princes. But a Grey Knight's dreadnought amplifying and coordinating those individual Aegis fields creates a psychic fortress that even greater demons struggle to penetrate. The effect extends beyond mere defense. The dreadnought serves as a psychic anchor for the entire force, stabilizing reality in the face of warp-spawned madness. When demons attempt to warp space and time, when they try to summon reinforcements from the Imperium, when they unleash reality-bending sorceries that should turn the battlefield into a nightmare realm, the presence of a Grey Knight's Dreadnought can hold reality firm. The machine becomes a beacon of order in the midst of chaos, an anchor point around which the laws of physics reassert themselves. This is achieved through what the Adeptus Mechanicus calls a Mastery Level 1 psychic rating, though that technical designation hardly captures the reality of what the Dreadnought can accomplish. The warrior within channels his psychic abilities through the machine's systems, manifesting powers with greater range and potency than he could achieve in his original flesh. Offensive abilities that might have struck a single target now wash over entire formations. Defensive wards that once protected only the Psyker himself now cover his entire squad. The prescient visions that allowed him to dodge enemy attacks now let him coordinate the movements of multiple units with perfect timing. And the Aegis, that fundamental core ability that defines every Grey Knight, becomes something altogether different when channeled through a Dreadnought. Where a Grey Knight in power armor projects an Aegis that might extend a few meters, a Dreadnought can project its field across dozens of meters, creating what observers have described as a hemisphere of psychic rejection that causes demons actual physical pain. Lesser demons caught within this field have been observed to weaken and fade, their connection to the material realm disrupted by the sheer purity of the Dreadnought's presence. The effect on demons is documented extensively in the Grey Knight's own records. Multiple accounts describe demon legions breaking and fleeing not from the Dreadnought's weapons, but from its mere approach. Greater demons who might stand toe-to-toe with entire companies of space marines will actively avoid engaging Grey Knight's Dreadnoughts, recognizing that the psychic environment around these machines is hostile to their very existence. One recorded instance describes a demon prince of Khorne, a being of pure rage and violence who lived only to kill, actually retreating from battle when a Grey Knight's Dreadnought arrived on the field. The demon's last words before banishment were telling: "I cannot touch that which burns with stolen fire." But to understand why Orks refuse to fight these machines, we must look beyond their anti-demon capabilities to what they represent psychically. A Grey Knight's Dreadnought is not merely a warrior in a machine. It is a walking nexus of anti-psychic force, a mobile suppression field that doesn't just resist psychic powers, but actively negates them in a specific and very particular way. The Aegis works by creating what tech priests call a null resonance in the warp. This is distinct from the blank spots created by pariahs or Sisters of Silence, who simply have no presence in the warp, and therefore create voids that psychic energies cannot cross. The Aegis does not remove the Grey Knight's presence from the warp. Instead, it transforms that presence into something purified, sanctified, and absolutely inimical to chaos. Imagine a fire that burns so clean and pure that it cannot consume anything but corruption itself. That is the nature of a Grey Knight's Dreadnought's psychic presence. This purification extends to the physical structure of the machine. Every bolt, every armor plate, every servos and gyroscope has been blessed by the chapter's chaplains, anointed with sacred oils, and subjected to rigorous psychic cleansing rituals. The machine spirits that inhabit Imperial technology are known to be capricious and often temperamental, requiring constant maintenance and prayer to function properly. But the machine spirit of a Grey Knight's Dreadnought is something different. Some tech priests believe it is not a machine spirit at all, but a reflection of the warrior's own psychic will, projected outward through the chassis. Whatever the theological truth, the practical result is a war machine that operates at peak efficiency in environments where other equipment would fail. While standard Imperial vehicles might misfire or malfunction when exposed to warp energies, while even blessed war gear might struggle in the presence of strong demonic influence, Grey Knight's Dreadnoughts function flawlessly. They have been recorded operating without maintenance for months at a time during extended campaigns in demon worlds, where the very laws of reality are in flux. The weaponry mounted on these chassis reflects both their anti-demon purpose and their enhanced capabilities. Many Grey Knights Dreadnoughts carry assault cannons or heavy incinerators, weapons capable of laying down withering fire against massed demon hordes. Others bear twin-linked autocannons, upgraded with Cybolt ammunition, shells that have been psychically blessed and contain trace amounts of sanctified materials that burn demon flesh like acid. Some carry massive Nemesis Doomfists, power fists that incorporate the same psychically active materials as the chapter's force weapons, allowing the Dreadnought to literally punch demons back into the warp. But again, these weapons are merely tools. The true weapon is the warrior within, and the psychic field he projects. A Grey Knight's Dreadnought could walk into battle completely unarmed and still represent a devastating threat to demonic forces. Its presence alone can disrupt summoning rituals, weaken demonic entities, and create zones where the warp cannot easily manifest. It is, in the most literal sense, anathema made manifest. And this is where our story intersects with the Orks' psychic nature in the most devastating way possible. The psychic collision. When War meets Aegis. We have established two fundamental truths. First, Orks are creatures of psychic gestalt, living and fighting as part of a shared field of psychic energy that shapes their reality, defines their hierarchy, and makes their crude technology function. Second, Grey Knights Dreadnoughts are walking generators of anti-corruption psychic force, designed specifically to negate, suppress, and purify demonic energies. Now we must examine what happens when these two forces meet on the battlefield. The WH field operates on belief and collective consciousness. It is not structured or disciplined like human psychic powers. An Ork psyker, called a Weird Boy, doesn't cast spells through learned techniques and careful manipulation of warp energies. Instead, he serves as a lightning rod for the raw psychic energy generated by nearby Orks, channeling it into explosive and barely controlled manifestations. The more Orks present, the more energy the Weird Boy must channel, until it becomes almost unbearable. Weird Boys have been known to literally explode from psychic overload when surrounded by too many of their kin during the height of battle. But even Orks, who are not Weird Boys, contribute to and benefit from the WH field. It flows through them constantly, an unconscious connection that tells them who to follow, when to fight, and what enemies are worth fighting. This connection is so fundamental to Ork psychology that severing it would be like cutting a human off from their sense of sight or hearing. They would still be alive, still capable of basic function, but something essential would be missing. This is what happens when an Ork approaches a Grey Knight's Dreadnought. The Aegis does not discriminate between types of psychic energy. Its purpose is to purify corruption, yes, but the mechanisms by which it achieves this affect all warp-based phenomena in its vicinity. The field projected by a Grey Knight's Dreadnought doesn't merely resist chaos. It actively suppresses psychic energies, creating a zone of psychic deadening that extends outward from the machine in all directions. For demons, this is painful but comprehensible. Demons are beings of pure warp energy, given physical form through concentration of belief and emotion. When that warp energy is suppressed, when the connection to the Imperium is disrupted, they weaken and fade. They understand this intuitively and react accordingly, either fleeing or attempting to destroy the source of the suppression. For Orks, the experience is fundamentally different and far more disturbing. An Ork approaching a Grey Knight's Dreadnought feels the WH field begin to falter and fade. The constant background sense of connection to their fellows, that psychic awareness of who is bigger and who deserves to lead, starts to dim. The absolute certainty that their weapons will work, that their vehicles will function, that they are part of something larger than themselves, all of it begins to slip away. Imagine a human suddenly losing their sense of balance and spatial awareness. You can still see, still hear, still think, but your body no longer seems to be where you think it is. Every movement becomes uncertain, every step potentially dangerous. Now magnify that disorientation 1,000-fold and apply it not just to physical sensation, but to fundamental identity. That is what an orc experiences in the psychic dead zone around a Grey Knight's dreadnought. The effect intensifies the closer an orc gets to the machine. At a distance of 50 or 60 meters, it might be barely noticeable. Just a vague sense that something is wrong, that this enemy is different from others. At 30 meters, the WH field is noticeably weakened. The orc can still feel it, but it seems muffled, distant, like trying to hear a conversation through thick walls. At 10 meters, the field is almost completely suppressed, and the orc finds himself in the profoundly disturbing position of being cut off from the psychic network that has defined his entire existence. This creates an immediate and visceral problem for orc combat effectiveness. Remember, the WH field is what makes orc technology work beyond its physical capabilities. An orc gun held together with wire and faith fires reliably because the orc believes it will fire, and the WH field makes that belief reality. But in the suppression field of a Grey Knight's dreadnought, that psychic reinforcement fails. Suddenly, the gun is just a poorly made piece of junk that jams on every third shot. The blade that should cut through armor plate becomes a bent chunk of scrap iron. Even the orc's own enhanced physiology begins to fail, as the psychic enhancement that makes him bigger and stronger than biology alone would allow starts to falter. Recorded observations from Imperial forces who have witnessed orcs attempting to engage Grey Knight's dreadnoughts describe the greenskins becoming visibly confused and disoriented. They stumble, their usual aggressive charge faltering into uncertain lurches. They swing their weapons with less force, their attacks losing the enthusiastic brutality that normally characterizes orc combat. And most tellingly, they begin to back away, retreating from the dreadnought, not through any tactical consideration, but from sheer psychic discomfort. This is not fear, not in any conventional sense. Orcs do not understand fear the way humans do. They lack the complex emotional framework that would allow them to contemplate mortality and find it worrying. An orc facing a tank battalion or a demon prince, or even a warp rift, doesn't feel fear. He feels excitement, anticipation, maybe a bit of concern about being shown up by his fellow orcs. But he doesn't flee from danger for its own sake. What makes them retreat from Grey Knight's dreadnoughts is not the danger of the machines, but the deeply wrong feeling of being near them. It's not that the orc thinks he might die fighting the dreadnought. He knows he might die fighting anything, and that's never stopped him before. It's that fighting near the dreadnought means fighting without the WH, without the psychic connection that makes him who he is. It means becoming alone, isolated, cut off from the collective consciousness that has been his constant companion since the moment he emerged from the spore fields. And for a creature whose entire psychology is built around that collective consciousness, whose very identity is inseparable from his role within the WH, that isolation is unacceptable. Not frightening, but fundamentally wrong on a level deeper than conscious thought. Like asking a fish to fight on dry land, or a human to battle while holding their breath indefinitely. Technically possible, but so uncomfortable and unnatural that every instinct screams to get away from the source of the problem. The orc's preference for fighting living enemies rather than machines compounds this issue. As we established earlier, orcs dislike fighting vehicles and war engines because there's no satisfying visceral quality to the combat. A tank doesn't scream when you crump it. A walker doesn't acknowledge your superiority when you tear it apart. Machines are boring enemies, tolerated only when nothing better is available. Grey Knights. Dreadnoughts present as machines. They walk on mechanical legs, fire weapons from mechanical mounts, and speak through mechanical vox grills. To an orc's visual assessment, They should register as just another walker, another boring target that will have to do if no proper enemies are available. But to an Ork's psychic senses, they register as something far worse, as active threats to the very field that makes an Ork function. So the Ork faces a terrible choice. He can engage this target that appears to be a boring machine while experiencing profound psychic discomfort and watching his weapons fail and his connection to the WH falter. Or he can turn his attention to literally any other target on the battlefield, all of which will be more satisfying to fight and won't cause existential disconnection from the psychic gestalt that defines his existence. Put that way, it's not really a choice at all. Even the most eager Ork, the most battle-crazed war boss, who has spent his entire life seeking the biggest and best fights, will find reasons to engage other enemies first. There's a perfectly good squad of space marines over there who will put up a proper fight. Or perhaps that Imperial guard tank company needs crumping before they cause trouble. Maybe those Eldar on the flank deserve attention. Everything else on the battlefield suddenly seems more appealing than closing with the silver machine that makes the wah go quiet. Observers have noted that Ork forces encountering Grey Knight's Dreadnoughts will actually flow around them like water around a stone. The greenskin tide that normally crashes forward in a barely controlled charge will part to either side of the Dreadnought, engaging other targets while leaving the machine standing alone in an empty zone. It's not a conscious tactical decision. Orks don't coordinate their movements with that kind of precision. It's an emergent behavior arising from thousands of individual Orks all independently deciding that any target other than the Dreadnought is preferable. This creates a strategic situation almost unique in Imperial warfare. Most enemies will prioritize the most dangerous threats, focusing fire on heavy weapons platforms and command units before engaging rank-and-file troops. This makes sense from a tactical perspective. Eliminate the greatest threats first. But Orks, operating on psychic revulsion rather than tactical calculation, will ignore what should be obvious priority targets in favor of enemies that won't disrupt their connection to the WH. A Grey Knight's Dreadnought can wade through an Ork horde with relative impunity, firing into massed formations at point-blank range, and the Orks will continue to surge past it toward other targets. The Dreadnought might kill hundreds of greenskins, might decimate entire mobs with sustained fire from its assault cannons and incinerators, but the Orks simply refuse to engage it directly. They would rather die attacking other enemies than survive by avoiding the Dreadnought, because attacking the Dreadnought means experiencing that profound and disturbing disconnection from the WH. There are recorded instances of war bosses attempting to override this behavior through sheer force of personality. A particularly large and successful war boss, feeling the need to prove himself against all enemies regardless of psychic discomfort, might order his boys to engage a Grey Knight's Dreadnought. But these orders rarely stick. The boys will charge forward initially, driven by loyalty to their leader and the expectation that the war boss knows best. Then, they hit the suppression field, feel the wah falter, and their weapons start jamming, and their certainty evaporates. What follows is not a rout. Orks don't rout in the conventional sense, but a spontaneous redirection of aggression toward more appealing targets. The boys don't run away so much as they decide that some other enemy over there suddenly looks much more interesting and fighting-worthy than this weird silver box that makes everything feel wrong. The war boss might bellow orders and crack skulls to maintain discipline, but he's fighting against every instinct his boys possess. And if the war boss himself gets too close to the Dreadnought, he'll start to feel the same psychic deadening, which tends to make him much less enthusiastic about pressing the attack. This dynamic has led to some remarkable tactical situations. During the Chagoris defense, a Grey Knight strike force numbering only a dozen warriors and a single Dreadnought held a critical pass against an Ork numbering in the tens of thousands. Standard doctrine would suggest the Orks should have overwhelmed the Grey Knights through sheer numerical superiority within minutes. Instead, the battle stretched on for hours as the Ork horde repeatedly attempted to flow around the Grey Knight's position, seeking other ways through the pass, rather than confronting the dreadnought that anchored the defense. The war boss leading the WH40K reportedly tried 17 separate times to organize a direct assault on the Grey Knight's position. Each time, the assault would disintegrate as Orks approaching the dreadnought lost their cohesion and diverted to engage other targets or simply stopped advancing. Eventually, the war boss gave up on tactics entirely and attempted a personal challenge, charging the dreadnought alone to prove his superiority. He made it within 5 meters before his weapons began to fail, and the psychic connection to his WH40K collapsed. At that point, standing in front of a dreadnought with non-functioning weapons and no psychic support, even a war boss of exceptional size and prowess had to acknowledge reality. He turned and walked away, not running, not fleeing, but simply choosing to fight different enemies. The Orks remember him saying, "That one's not right, we crumped a rest first." The WH40K moved on to find battles elsewhere, leaving the Grey Knights in undisputed control of the pass. Some Imperial scholars have suggested that this phenomenon could be weaponized more broadly. If Grey Knight's dreadnoughts create zones that Orks will not willingly enter, could they be deployed as area denial weapons? Could a small force of these machines control territory vastly exceeding what their numbers would suggest? The answer is complicated. Yes, Grey Knight's dreadnoughts can effectively create Ork-free zones around themselves. But this only works so long as alternative targets exist. If the dreadnought is the only enemy available, if there is literally nothing else to fight, Orks will eventually engage it despite the psychic discomfort. They won't enjoy it. Their weapons will function poorly, and they'll break off the engagement as soon as any other target presents itself. But they can force themselves to attack if no alternatives exist. Moreover, the Grey Knights themselves are far too rare and valuable to be deployed as simple area denial weapons. Each dreadnought represents a hero of the chapter who has accumulated irreplaceable knowledge and experience. Using such precious resources to simply occupy ground would be a criminal waste of their capabilities. Grey Knights deploy where their unique anti-demon abilities are necessary, not where their side effects against Orks might prove useful. But the phenomenon remains documented and studied. The Ordo Xenos has compiled extensive reports on Ork behavior around Grey Knights' forces, though they lack the full context to understand why the greenskins react as they do. Without knowledge of the Aegis and its psychic effects, Inquisitors have proposed theories ranging from pheromone-based deterrents to secret sonic weapons that cause Ork discomfort. A few have come close to the truth by suggesting psychic interference, but without access to the Grey Knight's own records, they cannot confirm the exact mechanisms. The Grey Knights themselves understand the phenomenon perfectly well. Their librarians have documented the effect in detail, noting how the Aegis projection from their dreadnoughts creates measurable disruption in the Ork gestalt field. They've studied the intensity curves, mapping how the suppression effect scales with distance and how it varies based on the size of the Ork force. They know that smaller Ork mobs are more severely affected than massive WH40K formations, because smaller groups have weaker gestalt fields to begin with. This knowledge occasionally informs tactical decisions. When deploying against mixed forces containing both demons and Orks, Grey Knights commanders will position their dreadnoughts to maximize disruption against both enemy types. The machines serve as psychic anchors against demonic corruption, while simultaneously creating zones that Ork forces will avoid, effectively splitting enemy armies and preventing coordination between separate threat types. But these tactical considerations, interesting as they are, miss the deeper and more profound point of why this phenomenon matters. The relationship between Orks and Grey Knights dreadnoughts reveals something fundamental about both species. It shows us that for all their savage simplicity, Orks are creatures of psychic connection, operating on levels they themselves don't consciously understand. And it demonstrates that the Grey Knight's purity and sanctification has effects extending far beyond their intended purpose of Combating chaos. There is something almost poetic about this incompatibility. The Orks represent collective consciousness taken to an extreme, individuality subsumed into the greater WH40K, psychic unity, enforcing hierarchy, and enabling crude technology to function through shared belief. The Grey Knight's Dreadnoughts represent individual purity and sanctification, elevated to such heights that they cannot help but disrupt any psychic energy in their vicinity, creating islands of clarity in an ocean of warp-spawned madness. When these two forces meet, neither yields and neither truly wins. The Dreadnought cannot force the Orks to engage, and the Orks cannot make themselves comfortable fighting near the Dreadnought. Instead, both sides tacitly agree to focus on other things, to find different enemies more suited to their particular natures. The Dreadnought will tear through demon hordes while the Orks surge elsewhere to crump guardsmen and space marines. Each achieves their goal. The Dreadnought banishes warp spawn while the Orks get their precious fighting, but they do so while carefully avoiding direct confrontation with each other. In a galaxy where conflict defines existence, where eternal war is the only constant, this mutual avoidance is remarkable. It speaks to forces deeper than strategy or tactics, to incompatibilities built into the very nature of both species. And it provides one of the few examples in Warhammer 40k where two enemies will actively avoid fighting each other, not from fear, not from alliance, but from sheer psychic incompatibility that makes the confrontation unbearable for one side and pointless for the other. The silent standoff. Historical encounters. The historical record of Ork and Grey Knights encounters is, by necessity, fragmentary. The Grey Knights are a secret chapter, their existence known only to the highest levels of Imperial authority. Most battles they fight are scrubbed from official records after their conclusion, witnesses memory wiped or executed to maintain the chapter's secrecy. The Inquisition considers knowledge of demon incursions and the forces that combat them too dangerous for common Imperial citizens, even those who might fight alongside the Grey Knights. But within the sealed vaults of the Ordo Malleus and the chapter's own archives on Titan, records do exist. And while the Grey Knights do not often fight Orks, their primary mission focuses on demonic threats. There have been occasions when necessity brought them into conflict with greenskin hordes. The pattern we have described appears again and again in these accounts, consistent enough that the chapter's librarians have documented it as a known phenomenon. One of the earliest recorded instances dates to the 34th millennium during the Wars of Apostasy. A massive Ork wave had erupted in the Segmentum Tempestus, threatening to overrun several dozen Imperial worlds, including 3 shrine worlds dedicated to the worship of the Emperor. Under normal circumstances, the Grey Knights would have no role in such a conflict. Ork invasions, however devastating, are matters for conventional Imperial Guard and Space Marine forces to handle. But this particular WH40K coincided with a major demon incursion led by a greater demon of Nurgle who sought to corrupt the shrine worlds and turn them into demon worlds dedicated to the plague god. The Grey Knights deployed to combat the demonic threat and found themselves fighting on the same battlefields where Ork and Imperial forces clashed. The battle records from this campaign, preserved in the chapter's archives, contain the first detailed documentation of Ork behavior around Grey Knight's Dreadnoughts. Brother Captain Garen, commanding the strike force, deployed 3 Dreadnoughts as anchors for his defensive lines. The expectation was that these venerable warriors would hold critical points against both demon and Ork attacks, while the rest of the Grey Knights focused on banishing the greater demon. What happened instead surprised even the experienced Grey Knights commanders. While demon forces threw themselves suicidally against the Dreadnoughts, despite taking horrific casualties, the Ork mobs simply flowed around them. Garen's initial assessment was that the Orks had recognized the Dreadnoughts as particularly dangerous enemies, and were avoiding them through tactical calculation. But as the battle progressed, it became clear that the Orks weren't avoiding the Dreadnoughts to preserve their forces. They were charging headlong into even more dangerous positions elsewhere on the battlefield. One particularly memorable account describes an Ork mob charging directly into massed heavy weapons fire from an Imperial Guard artillery position, rather than engaging a single Dreadnought that stood between them and a much softer target. The Orks took catastrophic casualties crossing open ground under sustained bombardment, but they did it rather than close with the Dreadnought. When questioned after the battle, the surviving guardsmen reported that the Orks seemed genuinely desperate to reach any target other than the Silver Walker, screaming their war cries with unusual fervor, as if trying to drown out some unpleasant sound. Librarian Mordecai, who accompanied the strike force, was the first to propose the psychic disruption theory. He had noticed that his own psychic abilities seemed amplified near the Dreadnoughts, a known effect of the Aegis network they projected. If the Aegis was enhancing sanctified psychic powers, he reasoned, it might be disrupting other forms of psychic energy. The Orks, known to possess crude psychic abilities, might be experiencing some form of interference from the Dreadnoughts' Aegis fields. This theory was tested during subsequent engagements in the campaign. Grey Knights deliberately positioned their Dreadnoughts to block Ork advance routes, creating what amounted to impassable barriers not through firepower, but through psychic discomfort. The strategy worked remarkably well. Ork forces that should have easily overrun isolated Grey Knights' positions instead diverted to attack far more dangerous targets, suffering heavy casualties, but achieving their objective of avoiding the Dreadnoughts. By the campaign's end, the Greater Demon had been banished, and the Ork WH disrupted enough that conventional Imperial forces could mop up the remaining greenskin forces. The Grey Knights withdrew as they always did, leaving no evidence of their presence. But the lessons learned from that campaign were documented thoroughly in the chapter's tactical databases. Another significant encounter occurred during the Genestealer uprising on Valnir Prime in M37. A Genestealer cult had infiltrated the planet's mining operations and summoned a demon prince to aid in their rebellion. Grey Knights responded to the demonic incursion, deploying a small strike force led by Grandmaster Vorth aboard his personal dreadnought, a venerable machine dating back to the chapter's founding. The planet was also host to a significant feral Ork population, descendants of a WH that had struck the world centuries earlier and never been fully eradicated. These feral Orks should have posed a significant threat to the mining colonies, but they had been largely ignored in favor of defending against the Genestealer cult. When the Demon Prince manifested, it attempted to bind both the Genestealers and the feral Orks into a single corrupted force. Grandmaster Vorth's campaign diary, one of the few personal accounts preserved from that era, describes the strange battlefield dynamics. His dreadnought advanced into the Demon Prince's summoning grounds, the Aegis field at full strength to prevent the entity from drawing more power from the warp. Genestealer cultists charged the dreadnought with suicidal fervor, as expected for enemies already corrupted by demonic influence. But the feral Orks, who had been observed fighting with savage enthusiasm against Imperial forces for months, simply refused to approach. Vorth describes watching Ork mobs literally turn and run when his dreadnought came into view, not from fear, but from what he interpreted as profound discomfort. The feral Orks lacked the sophisticated understanding of their more civilized kin, operating on pure instinct, without the tempering influence of mech boys or weird boys to give them guidance. When confronted with the Aegis field, their instinctive response was to get away from it as quickly as possible, even if that meant exposing themselves to gunfire from Imperial defenders. The Demon Prince attempted to use this behavior, trying to herd the Orks toward the dreadnought as unwilling meat shields. But the Orks' revulsion to the Aegis proved stronger than their fear of the demon. Given a choice between approaching the dreadnought or facing the daemon's wrath, the feral Orks chose the daemon every time. Some turned on their supposed demonic master, others fled into the wilderness, and a few simply stood in place, roaring their frustration at the impossible choice. This behavior, Vorth notes, proved tactically valuable. The Demon Prince had intended to use the Orc hordes as a buffer between himself and the Grey Knights, forcing the Silver Warriors to fight through waves of greenskin flesh before reaching the primary target. Instead, the Orcs' refusal to engage the Dreadnought created clear lanes of fire. Vorth was able to advance directly on the Demon Prince with minimal interference, ultimately banishing the entity back to the warp, while the feral Orcs scattered to all points of the compass. More recent accounts come from the Ghazghkull Thraka campaigns. The notorious Orc warlord has clashed with countless Imperial forces across multiple sectors, building and rebuilding his WH40K with remarkable persistence. During the Third War for Armageddon, a Grey Knight strike force deployed to combat demon incursions, spawned by the massive bloodshed of that conflict. The Grey Knight's own records from Armageddon are sealed at the highest level of secrecy. The campaign involved actions so controversial that even acknowledging them could undermine faith in the Imperium. But fragments have emerged through inquisitorial reports and battlefield observations by other Imperial forces. These fragments consistently describe Orc forces avoiding Grey Knights' positions with unusual determination, flowing around their deployments like water around rocks. One particularly detailed account comes from an Ultramarines captain who fought alongside the Grey Knights for several days during the battle for Hive Tartarus. He describes watching a Grey Knight's dreadnought wade into the midst of an Orc horde numbering in the thousands. The captain expected the dreadnought to be overwhelmed within minutes, pulled down by sheer weight of numbers regardless of how many Orcs it killed. Instead, he witnessed the Orc tide part around the dreadnought, individual greenskins changing direction mid-charge to avoid closing with the machine. Some Orcs fired at the dreadnought from a distance, but their shots were wild and ineffective, as if their hearts weren't in the attack. The vast majority simply ignored the dreadnought entirely, surging past to engage Ultramarines' positions instead. The captain questioned a Grey Knight's librarian about this strange behavior. The librarian's response, recorded in the captain's personal journal, was cryptic but revealing. "The unclean cannot abide purity, Captain. Whether that uncleanliness stems from chaos or from the crude psychic emanations of Xenos matters little to the Aegis. It rejects all corruption, and in doing so, creates an environment where certain enemies cannot comfortably operate." This same pattern appears in accounts from the Ghazghkull campaigns on Peshina during the Octavius War, and in scattered reports from dozens of smaller conflicts. Wherever Grey Knight's dreadnoughts deploy against mixed forces that include Orcs, the Greenskins demonstrate consistent reluctance to engage the machines directly. The intensity of this reluctance seems to scale with the size and sophistication of the Orc force. Larger, more organized Way-eggs show slightly less aversion than small feral bands, presumably because their stronger Gestalt field can partially resist the Aegis suppression. But even the most powerful Orc warbosses display discomfort around Grey Knight's dreadnoughts. There are no recorded instances of a warboss successfully leading a sustained assault against a dreadnought position. Attempts to do so invariably break down as the advancing Orcs lose cohesion and enthusiasm the closer they get to their target. One fascinating case involves warboss Gruk Face Ripper, who led a WH40K into the Cryptus system in M41. Gruk was noted for his exceptional size, standing nearly 12 feet tall and claiming leadership over hundreds of thousands of Orcs. When his forces encountered a Grey Knight strike force, he reportedly declared that he would personally crump the shiniest git he could find, meaning the Grey Knight's dreadnought that anchored their defensive position. Gruk charged the dreadnought with his personal retinue of mega-armored knobs, bellowing challenges and swinging his massive power claw. He made it to within 20 meters of the dreadnought before his advance faltered. Observers reported that Gruk stopped mid-charge, looked around in confusion, and then redirected his attack toward a squad of Grey Knight's Terminators standing nearby. When questioned after the battle by his subordinates about why he didn't engage the dreadnought as promised, Gruk reportedly said, "It weren't proper. Needed to crump something, dated crump back proper-like." This phrase, "it weren't proper," appears repeatedly in Orc communications intercepted during encounters with Grey Knight's dreadnoughts. The greenskins struggle to articulate why they won't engage these particular machines, but they consistently describe them as wrong, improper, or not right for crumping. They don't claim the dreadnoughts are too dangerous or too tough. They simply insist that fighting them isn't proper or satisfying, as if there's something fundamentally incorrect about the matchup that offends orc sensibilities. Imperial scholars studying these accounts have proposed various theories. Some suggest the orcs have learned through experience that Grey Knight's dreadnoughts are unusually dangerous and have developed instinctive avoidance behavior. But this explanation fails to account for why orcs will eagerly engage equally dangerous enemies without hesitation. An orc who will charge headlong into an Imperial Guard's super-heavy tank shouldn't be deterred by a single dreadnought, regardless of how many weapons it carries. Others have suggested that the visual appearance of Grey Knight's dreadnoughts triggers some deep-seated instinct in the orc psyche, perhaps related to ancient enemies from the War in Heaven. This is more plausible, but still doesn't explain the specificity of the aversion. Orcs fight other dreadnoughts, from standard Space Marine variants to the massive Contemptor and Leviathan patterns, without showing similar reluctance. The truth, as the Grey Knights understand it, lies in the psychic interaction between Aegis and WH40K. It's not the physical form of the dreadnought that orcs avoid, but the psychic dead zone it creates. And this understanding has tactical implications that extend beyond simple battlefield deployments. The deeper implications, what this tells us. The phenomenon of orcs avoiding Grey Knights. Dreadnoughts is more than just a battlefield curiosity. It reveals fundamental truths about both species that have implications for understanding how these factions operate and how they might be countered or utilized. First and most obviously, it confirms the psychic nature of orc society in ways that observation alone cannot. Orcs are notoriously difficult to study. They don't cooperate with inquisitorial investigations. They don't surrender for interrogation, and dissecting dead orcs reveals only their fungal physiology without explaining their psychological drives. But their behavior around Grey Knight's dreadnoughts provides indirect evidence of the WH field's existence and properties. If the Gestalt field was merely a curiosity, an interesting but ultimately minor aspect of orc biology, disrupting it wouldn't cause such dramatic behavioral changes. The fact that orcs will abandon tactically sound positions, ignore dangerous priority targets, and generally behave irrationally to avoid the Aegis suppression field proves that the WH is fundamental to how orcs function. Remove their connection to it, and they become profoundly uncomfortable, unable or unwilling to operate effectively. This suggests potential strategies for combating orc invasions. If the WH field could be disrupted on a large scale, orc forces might lose cohesion even without being destroyed through conventional military action. The challenge, of course, is achieving such disruption. Grey Knight's dreadnoughts create only localized dead zones. Blanks and pariahs can suppress psychic activity, but they are vanishingly rare, and their effect on orcs is unpredictable. The WH field operates differently enough from standard psyker abilities that conventional anti-psychic measures don't always work. The Adeptus Mechanicus has experimented with psychic dampening technology based on observations of orc behavior around Grey Knight's forces. These devices attempt to create artificial dead zones that mimic the Aegis effect. Results have been mixed at best. Without the blessing and sanctification that makes the Aegis work, without the purity of purpose embodied in the Grey Knights themselves, technological solutions tend to either fail entirely or create unpredictable side effects. One prototype device successfully disrupted a small orc warband, but also caused severe psychic backlash that killed the tech priests operating it. For the Grey Knights themselves, understanding this phenomenon influences deployment decisions in subtle ways. They know that positioning a dreadnought can effectively channel orc advances, creating paths of least resistance that guide greenskin forces away from critical positions. This is particularly valuable in mixed engagements where both demons and orcs are present. The dreadnought, can serve double duty, suppressing demonic manifestations while simultaneously creating orc-free zones that allow the Grey Knights to focus on their primary targets without distraction. But this knowledge also highlights a limitation. Grey Knights Dreadnoughts are tremendously effective against chaos, but less useful against orcs than standard combat might suggest. Yes, they can kill orcs efficiently with their weapons, but orcs will avoid them when possible, meaning the Dreadnought's combat effectiveness is limited by the enemy's unwillingness to engage. Against demons that are compelled to attack by the very nature of the Aegis, this isn't a problem. Against orcs who would rather fight anything else, it represents a curious tactical situation where the greatest strength, the Aegis field, becomes something of a limitation. From the orc perspective, this phenomenon demonstrates that for all their apparent simplicity, greenskins possess sophisticated sensory capabilities that extend beyond physical sight and hearing. They can detect psychic fields, distinguish between different types of psychic emanations, and respond to these detections at a level that might not be fully conscious, but is no less real for that. This has implications for understanding orc decision-making in general. Imperial tacticians often assume orc strategy is purely reactive, that greenskins simply attack the nearest or most obvious target without deeper consideration. But the avoidance of Grey Knights Dreadnoughts proves that orcs can and do make calculations based on factors invisible to normal senses. They prioritize targets not just by visual assessment, but by psychic compatibility, seeking enemies that will provide satisfying engagement within the context of the WH field. Perhaps most intriguingly, this phenomenon raises questions about what else orcs might be avoiding or seeking based on psychic sensing. Do they preferentially attack enemies with strong psychic presences because such enemies create more interesting disturbances in the WH field? Do they avoid areas with unusual psychic geography, or are they drawn to them? The historical record provides hints, but no definitive answers. There are documented cases of orc wargs changing course to attack seemingly random targets, ignoring more valuable or vulnerable objectives to strike at locations that make little strategic sense. Some inquisitors have theorized that these course changes might be driven by psychic factors. Perhaps the orcs sense something about the psychic terrain that makes certain targets more appealing than logic would suggest. Similarly, there are instances of orc forces deliberately avoiding regions that should be prime targets for looting and fighting. After the Badab War, substantial orc populations existed in several surrounding sectors, yet they largely ignored the war-torn systems, despite the abundance of salvage and weak defenses that should have attracted them. Could there have been psychic factors that made these systems unappealing? We may never know, as the relevant inquisitorial investigations were terminated when the sectors were eventually repopulated by Imperial forces. For the broader Imperium, this phenomenon serves as a reminder that the galaxy contains interactions and compatibilities that transcend simple physical combat. The Orks and Grey Knights. Dreadnoughts exist in different psychic registers, operating on frequencies that don't align. When they meet, the result is not increased conflict, but mutual avoidance, a tacit agreement to find different enemies more suited to their particular natures. This is perhaps the most profound implication of all. In a universe defined by endless war, where conflict is the only constant, and peace is a concept so alien as to be almost meaningless, there nonetheless exist combinations of forces that prefer not to fight each other, not from alliance or mutual interest, but from sheer incompatibility that makes combat more unpleasant than simply engaging different enemies. The Grey Knights continue their eternal crusade against the demonic, their dreadnoughts serving as anchors of purity in an impure galaxy. The Orks continue their endless wag, seeking the biggest and best fights across countless systems. And when these two forces meet, they acknowledge each other's existence and then politely agree to fight other things instead. The Dreadnoughts will tear through demon hordes while the Orks rampage elsewhere, each achieving their objectives without the uncomfortable necessity of direct confrontation. In the grim darkness of the far future, this represents something almost like wisdom. The recognition that not every enemy needs to be engaged. That sometimes the most effective strategy is simply to focus on what you do best against foes that match your particular strengths. The Grey Knights are unmatched demon hunters. The Orks are unstoppable when fighting enemies that feed their wag. When these two truths collide, the universe demonstrates a rare instance of efficiency, each force doing what it does best without wasting resources on an engagement that would satisfy neither party. Conclusion. The silent truth. We have journeyed through psychic theory, examined historical records, and explored the fundamental natures of two of the galaxy's most formidable factions. We have seen how the Orks' Gestalt consciousness and the Grey Knights' sanctified purity create an incompatibility so profound that even the most fight-hungry Xenos in existence would rather battle anything else. This is not widely known. The Grey Knights' very existence remains secret from most of the Imperium. Their encounters with Ork forces, already rare, are documented in sealed archives that few will ever access. The Orks themselves lack the introspection and communication skills to explain what they experience, falling back on phrases like, "It ain't proper," without articulating the deeper psychic discomfort they feel. But the truth persists in scattered battle reports, in the observations of those rare individuals who have fought alongside the Grey Knights, in the tactical databases maintained on Titan. The truth is that Orks won't fight Grey Knights' Dreadnoughts, not because they can't, but because doing so requires them to operate without the psychic gestalt that defines their very existence. It requires them to fight alone, isolated, cut off from the wag, in ways that make combat profoundly unsatisfying, even when they could theoretically achieve victory. And so the Silver Dreadnoughts wade through battlefields, largely unmolested by greenskin hordes, their weapons speaking death to demons, while Orks surge past to find more suitable enemies. It is an arrangement that suits both sides, though neither would frame it in such diplomatic terms. The Grey Knights need the Orks to focus elsewhere, so the Silver Warriors can concentrate on their demon-hunting mission. The Orks need to fight enemies that don't disrupt their wag, so they can enjoy combat properly. In a galaxy where there is only war, where peace is an impossible dream and conflict defines existence, this mutual avoidance stands as a peculiar example of how even endless hostilities can find unexpected patterns. Not every enemy must be engaged. Not every threat demands immediate response. Sometimes the wisest course is to let incompatible forces pass each other by, each seeking battles more suited to their nature. The Grey Knights understand this. Their tactical doctrine includes guidelines for using dreadnoughts to channel Ork advances away from critical positions. They know that the very quality that makes their dreadnoughts supremely effective against chaos, the Aegis field that purifies and sanctifies, creates zones that Orks will avoid. They use this knowledge when necessary, deploy it strategically when appropriate, and otherwise focus on their true mission of combating the demonic. The Orks understand this too, in their own way. They know that some enemies are proper for fighting and others ain't. They know that the Silver Walkers with their quiet, wrong feeling should be avoided when better targets exist. They don't question this instinct, don't analyze it or try to overcome it. They simply accept it as truth and move on to find fights that will actually be enjoyable. And so the pattern perpetuates, one of the stranger tactical realities, in a galaxy full of strangeness. Grey Knights' dreadnoughts remain unengaged by Ork forces, not through fear or respect, but through psychic incompatibility that both sides silently acknowledge. It is a small detail in the vast tapestry of imperial warfare, easily overlooked, rarely discussed, but no less real for its obscurity. For those who study the deeper mechanics of this dark millennium, for those who seek to understand not just what happens but why, this phenomenon offers valuable insights. It shows that psychic forces can be as decisive as physical ones. It demonstrates that different species operate on different frequencies, sometimes literally, and it proves that even in a universe of total war, there exist pockets of non-engagement. brief moments where incompatible forces simply agree to fight someone else. The Orks will continue their wag across the galaxy, seeking the biggest and best fights, growing larger with each victory, drawn by the gestalt field that makes them what they are. The Grey Knights will continue their crusade against chaos, their dreadnoughts anchoring reality against the madness of the warp, purifying corruption wherever they find it. And when these forces meet, they will continue to politely ignore each other, each achieving their goals by focusing on enemies more suited to their particular strengths. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, sometimes the most effective strategy is knowing which wars not to fight. If you found this exploration of the strange relationship between Orks and Grey Knights dreadnoughts fascinating, if you enjoyed delving into the psychic mechanics that underpin so much of Warhammer 40k's setting, then please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. We explore the deeper lore of this dark millennium, examining the hidden connections and subtle interactions that make this universe so rich and compelling. Hit the notification bell to ensure you don't miss future investigations into the mysteries of the 41st millennium. And if you have questions or theories about other unusual interactions in Warhammer 40k lore, leave them in the comments below. The galaxy is vast, and there are countless stories yet to be told. Until next time, may the Emperor protect, and may your guns always fire true, unless you're facing a Grey Knight's dreadnought, in which case you might want to find something else to shoot.